Don't worry about anything. If anything ever bothers you, just cry.
Those of you who've been following me for the past, 4 years probably saw this coming. I'm reviewing Splatoon. Splatoon is a game that I think throughout the gaming community at large is fairly misunderstood. So hopefully today, I'll help you understand the Squid Game and why those of us who like it so much do like it so much. You should keep in mind that I'm going to be talking about a lot of different things, a lot of different experiences that you can have in this game, and pretty much all of it applies to Splatoon 2. So, as much as it may or may not apply to this game, spoilers.
Splatoon's the game, only on wii-u. Make a mess is what you gotta do. You can splat the wall, splat the floor, splat each other, splat some more. The team with the most things splatted will win. Now you know the rules, so come on, let's begin.
These commercials that nobody but me seems to like sum up the game well. You're a kid who can shoot ink, then you're a squid who can swim through ink. You play against other players, and your goal is to cover as much stuff with ink as you can. Splatoon was announced at E3 in 2014, and as far as I can tell, it was on pretty much every gaming enthusiast's mind in one way or another. Some were really excited, while some dismissed it as another Nintendo party game. Shovelware with a fancy coat of paint. I mean ink. Haha. As for me, I knew I was still going to buy it because of the novel concept alone, but I still didn't have any preconceptions regarding the execution. Regardless of the variety of opinions and expectations people may have had leading up to the game's release, the game's mechanics were conveyed extremely well. This 90s kids' toy commercial is a great example of that, but really, I think just seeing a little bit of gameplay is enough for most people. It's really cool how intuitive this game is for something that's never been done before. Nonetheless, once you start the game, you're put into a tutorial. As tutorials go, this is about as good as it gets. You're taught to shoot ink to attack, swim in ink to move faster and refill ink, that you can jump in both kid and squid form, that you can use sub-weapons, and that you can climb up walls. There are these optional balloons strewn across the map to encourage players to check the area out. This map has pretty large open areas with plenty of variance in elevation, so it's a great area for players to experiment with the Splattershot Junior's shooting. The map being so big and open should also get new players to understand that just walking around is generally not going to cut it. It's just too slow. Spreading ink is really important because swimming is so much faster. At the end, you're taken to Inkopolis, and the game essentially uses Inkopolis as its main menu, so once the player reaches this point, they won't need to replay the tutorial again. It's comprehensive for new players and unintrusive for experienced ones. If you've seen a video like this before, I'm sure you've heard a similar spiel about a game's tutorial section, but my point is, Splatoon's tutorial serves as a great example of something more fundamental. Something that I really like seeing in games is a good combination of depth and accessibility. And I mean actual accessibility. I don't just mean games being dumbed down so that only the lowest common denominator can enjoy them. I mean games that can be equally enjoyed by people who are complete noobs to tryhards like me who like to pretend that a video game is important. Splatoon pulls this off pretty much perfectly. I'm sure you already got that impression from my opening bit about how well the mechanics were conveyed in its initial marketing, but I think the core gameplay itself is the biggest factor. Just think about how the game works. You spread ink on the ground, you shoot enemies with ink. Spreading ink and fighting opponents draws from the same resource and fundamentally requires the same action. I think this is why the tutorial is so effective. The mechanics pretty much teach themselves, all starting with just shooting at the balloons and noticing the ink on the ground. Similarly, when you're actually in a game, if a player's shooting at an enemy and completely missing, Hell, even if they're on the other side of the map from the enemy and shooting at nothing, they're contributing. They're spreading ink, they're building their special meter, they're taking map control, they're helping their team's maneuverability and hindering the enemies. And oh yeah, in Turf War, they're racking up points. Turf War is the game mode available to play in
regular battle,
and likely the first thing players will try once they get past the opening bit. As mentioned in almost all of the promotional material, covering the ground with ink gets points directly. That's it. Splatting enemies won't do it, just cover stuff up with ink. You got 3 minutes, whichever team has more of the map covered when time's up wins. It's definitely a simple game mode, and that's the intention. In competitive multiplayer games, it doesn't get much more accessible than being able to walk forward while holding down the trigger and still potentially contributing a lot to the team. I believe one of the biggest reasons for Splatoon's success, if not the biggest reason, is the clarity of its unique mechanics, and a lot of that is owed to the Turf War game mode. Something else that Turf War helps highlight is how Splatoon stands out from its contemporaries. And I say contemporaries because, remember, Splatoon is a shooter, a multiplayer, competitive, team-based shooter. It's Nintendo's first entry into a genre that's been going strong for a long time and doesn't seem like it's going anywhere for the foreseeable future. Maybe you were in your prime back when deathmatch was a twinkle in John Romero's eye. Maybe you're a baby who grew up knowing Call of Duty to be the dominating force in gaming. Or maybe you're stuck in the middle, an avocado toast eating millennial like me, with fond memories of staying the night at a friend's house playing Halo. Whatever the case, if you're into video games, you know how things have been for a while now. Superficially realistic military shooters everywhere, and they all look like this. Starting from about the mid-2000s, these games have dominated the market. And good golly, am I mad about it. I mean, these are just puerile experiences for the unwashed masses, not highbrow entertainment for discerning gentlemen like myself. I mean, what happened to creativity? We've been through years of what seemed like an endless number of military-themed competitive shooting games. Games featuring hardened warriors whose objective is shooting the enemy in a brown and gray-colored war zone. It's easy to see how Splatoon is a breath of fresh air. A game in which you play as children with super soakers, and the goal isn't to shoot the enemy, but to give the brown and gray environment some color. For many, Splatoon comes off as a subversion of the very genre it's a part of. A statement from Nintendo that it could do it too, and do it in its own style. So, Splatoon is original, and it's accessible. Cool. Sick. But it's also a multiplayer shooter. These games are meant to be played long term. If people are going to sink the same amount of hours into Splatoon that people have sunk into Counter-Strike, it needs more going for it than some elegant design concepts some monotone idiot on YouTube can appreciate. And more to the point, although novelty and accessibility can be good at bringing in an initial player base, if it doesn't have any depth, even the most casual players are going to get bored before too long and bail. Remember how I complained earlier about there being too many games like Call of Duty? There was a reason I sounded sarcastic. It's because I was being sarcastic. I actually mostly disagree with this narrative. This idea that there are just too many military shooters coming out and creativity is dead. I chose the various clips I showed for a reason. Only 2 of the games I'm showing here play similarly. Counter-Strike Source and Counter-Strike Go, which you may notice are part of the same series. Seeing these clips without context, without having played the games, you might forgive someone for thinking that these are all clones. They may all belong to similar genres, you can point a gun and shoot people in all of them, but the details that differentiate Counter-Strike and Call of Duty are more than enough to make a big difference for someone who wants to really sink their teeth into a game. And oh yeah, this one's serious, Sam. If these games can share similar settings and premises, but manage to be different enough to feel like unique experiences, I think it stands to reason that the inverse can be true. A game can be totally different from these in terms of art direction, story, setting, atmosphere, and so on, yet share plenty of other fundamental things in common with them. A while ago I was streaming Splatoon 2, and one of my viewers said something like, Oh, I didn't know there were other game modes. I thought it was just the one where you ink territory. And I think that sums up the situation with Splatoon's public perception in general. Among general audiences, Splatoon is just that game where you ink territory and you don't kill other players. Why, it's the perfect shooter for people who don't like shooters.
And that is the only way to win. Getting kills, and I can't stress this enough, is really not all that important.
I'm not as into shooters as I once was in the mid to late 2000s.
I'm not very big into shooter games, and I'm also not really big into competitive multiplayer games.
Splatoon is a shooter for people who don't like shooters, and that is most certainly a good thing.
Anyone who takes the game even slightly seriously has to tangle with all kinds of concepts the game has in common with other shooters. For me, Splatoon scratches the same itches as Counter-Strike, Halo, or Quake. All of the skills put to the test in a traditional shooter are put to the test just as much in Splatoon. Aim, positioning, reflexes, crosshair placement, movement, sense of timing, ammo management, teamwork and communication, game sense. Many shooters balance their weapons with traits like varying accuracy and rates of fire. Splatoon does too. Other shooters have bee-hopping, sprinting, wall running. Splatoon has swimming. Many modern shooters include ways to customize your stats or loadout, including Splatoon with its various weapon versions and gear abilities. Most shooters have camping, Splatoon has sharking. And on that note, of course, Splatoon takes the ubiquitous concept of map control and dials it up to 11. So out of those, let me give a brief summary of some of the weapons as an example. As I do, you should be able to pretty easily see how these weapons are balanced based on their strengths and weaknesses. This one's terrible at ink spread. Awful. In most traditional shooters, sniper rifles deal a lot of damage per shot, often a one-hit kill. But they have a slow rate of fire. This makes them easily punishable if they miss a shot, and they will often have much lower potential to engage multiple enemies at once than rapid-firing weapons. This should remind you of Splatoon's Charger class of weapons, the quintessential of which being, of course, the Splat Charger. Meanwhile, more rapid-firing weapons like Splatoon's Splattershot or Counter-Strike's UMP can put out many rounds quickly, but have lower damage per shot and lower effective range than something like the Splat Charger or the Op. Splatoon's rollers can deal a lot of damage per hit and thrive in close range engagements, just like various different games' shotguns and melee weapons. They also have the same drawback: you have to close in on the enemy first. Pretty much everything outranges them. Now is not the time for deep discussion on weapon balance in Splatoon, but you get the general idea, yeah? For all the ways Splatoon is different and unique, the philosophy behind its weapon selection is very much in line with pretty much any other shooter. And that is a very good thing. And getting kills does matter, by the way. I'm not sure why people say this. It's true that Splatoon doesn't have any game modes in which getting a certain number of kills is a direct win condition, but this is the case for plenty of game modes in other games as well. You wouldn't say that getting kills doesn't matter in some games' capture the flag mode. Even in Turf War, the fact is, if your team gets wiped 4 times in a row, it's going to be hard to come back from that. I went through my stupid list earlier of things Splatoon has in common with other shooters, and depending on your gaming background, a couple of them might have particularly stood out to you. Crosshair placement and aim. More importantly, the latter. How can aim be important in a console shooter, you ask? Idiot. An answer you might not like. Motion controls. Nintendo had already proven that motion controls could be sick with a few games, but Splatoon was the one that absolutely sold me on them. I'm not exaggerating when I say that shooting game aiming with motion controls can be just about as good as shooting game aiming with mouse controls, and I say that as somebody with over 14 years of PC FPS experience. I've seen a lot of derision of the idea of playing with motion controls. I think people have this negative attitude because most other examples in gaming are either shallow gimmicks or outright bad.
Well, bam! There it is.
If you're remotely capable of critical thinking, I'm sure it goes without saying that the fact that many or even most examples aren't good doesn't mean that every use of motion controls should be dismissed. But even for those who do try out motion controls in Splatoon, I've heard time and time again that they'll just immediately turn them off again because they're not what they're used to. They'll then come to the conclusion that motion controls suck, and anyone who uses them is an idiot. I'm gonna be honest here. If that's you, you're a brainlet. Let me tell you a story. This is actually one of my favorite stories in the gaming world. In the year 2000, Argonaut Games made a game called Alien Resurrection, you know, based on the movie. It's a pretty good game in some ways. Whatever, maybe I'll talk about it in detail in a future video, maybe not. The main thing to note about the game, however, is its default control scheme. In Alien Resurrection, you use the left analog stick to move your character around, forward, back, strafe left and right, everything in between. You use the right stick to look around, to aim. Sound familiar? Yep. The exact same control scheme used by pretty much every console shooter for the past like 15 years. And Alien Resurrection was the first to do it. As far as I can tell, maybe some other game did it first. Let me know if so, because I'm curious. Whatever the case, Alien Resurrection was at least a little bit ahead of its time in this regard. That didn't stop GameSpot reviewer, Stephen Garrett from complaining that the controls were, quote, the game's most terrifying element, end quote. He went on to say that the game would have done well to implement the same control scheme as Medal of Honor, taking the irony to ridiculous levels. It's just the dude's opinion, shouldn't get too worked up about it, but still, I really like the story of somebody getting absolutely owned by hindsight. More to the point though, this is a perfect example of how inflexible some people can be when it comes to new control schemes. Anything that they're not used to, really. Think about it this way. What's the alternative? Tank controls. Aren't you glad somebody decided to branch out? Similarly, rather than taking the time to get used to Splatoon's motion controls, so many have the knee-jerk reaction of, this isn't what I'm used to, so it's bad. I mean, if you just don't want to use them, that's fine. I'm an adult, and I don't get pissed off by people having different preferences to me, but that's a two-way street. The sheer incredulity I've seen from people who don't like motion controls and are just baffled that quite a few people do use them, it's a little asinine. There's this attitude that since motion controls must be a gimmick, only kids or complete casuals would use them. It's the opposite. Pretty much every top Splatoon player uses them, and if you look at them play for a little while, you'll see why. Or even just a slightly above average player like myself. The Wii U's motion controls, as implemented in Splatoon, allow for a combination of speed and precision that's simply impossible with joysticks. It's not quite on the same level as mouse aiming, but it's close. More importantly, it's different from mouse aiming. It's a unique experience and it just feels good. Aiming with motion controls feels awesome to me. So, just like precise mouse aim can be a big part of the fun in a more traditional competitive shooter, I've had a lot of fun in Splatoon landing charger shots, getting blaster directs, or even just trying to aim well to spread ink efficiently. If a game is going to maintain competitive interest, I would say that gameplay that feels good is not only very important, but outright necessary, but it's not the only thing you need. Rule sets that encourage competition are also pretty much a key factor. I mentioned earlier that the Turf War mode is a big reason why the game is so easy for people to get into. Well, guess what? You better start calling it Turd War. Because some things about its design are suboptimal for competitive play. At least that's what I think. And apparently Nintendo agrees, since Turf War isn't available to play in ranked mode. This alone is a huge indicator that Nintendo was doing more than just paying lip service when it comes to the potential for competitive Splatoon. So anyway, what's the deal with Turf War? For one, the fact that Turf War rewards covering the ground with ink in and of itself actually takes some depth away from the act of painting the map. In a game of, say, Splat Zones, players who are playing optimally make decisions all the time about whether to paint a certain area or what areas they should paint. After all, time spent putting down ink is time not spent contesting the objective. Do I really have any reason to be spreading ink here? Not usually, but maybe I want a shark or put down a cheeky beacon. What about here? I don't know, man. It depends on the situation. In Turf War, the answer to such questions is pretty much always yes. Yes, I want to put down ink here because ideally this needs to be painted when the game ends. Everything does. Not a whole lot of interesting decision making there, is there? There's a bigger issue with Turf War though, one that's probably the most commonly cited issue among serious players. It's the idea that the last 30 seconds, or whatever period of time, is the only part of the match that matters. When a Turf War match ends, the current state of the map is what determines victory. If there is more orange ink than blue ink at that very moment, orange team wins. It doesn't matter if the blue team had more ink down for the majority of the match. If blue team was absolutely dominating the whole game, and orange manages to have one really good push and spread a lot of ink at the very last moment, everything blue did up to that point doesn't matter. What I just described is a comeback, and in and of itself, it's not a problem. This kind of thing can happen in the competitive game modes too, and actually, when Rainmaker was first added to the game, people had similar concerns. I've been showing a game I recently recorded of Rainmaker in which my team was massively behind from the very start, and then turned it into a win. It's embarrassing because I played like garbage and contributed nothing to my team but a little ink spread and whiffed charger shots, but whatever. This was the first time I've held a Wii U gamepad in over a year and it's relevant footage, so deal with it. The same principles hold true here. The enemy team made a very good play early on, but my team turned it around, rendering the enemy's good play meaningless. They lost just the same. Is there a problem with that? No, absolutely not. Games like this are intense, they're exciting, they're fun. The limitation of Turf War is that because it has no knockouts, it's outright impossible for a team to win earlier than the 3-minute mark, no matter how well they do. In the game modes that Ranked is limited to, Splat Zones, Tower Control, and Rainmaker, there's a time limit just like in Turf War. Whichever team has made the most progress towards achieving the goal by the time limit wins. But if they actually completely achieve that goal, they instantly get a knockout win. In this Rainmaker game, while it's true that my team's comeback negated the enemy team's previous efforts, the fact remains they could have won right here. Because any given push could result in a knockout, every moment of the game is important. In Turf War, a hugely successful push into mid that lets you lock your opponents into their base is likely to lead your team to victory. Later. Not really as exciting, is it? There's one more minor quirk with Turf War, which is the scoring system. Like I've mentioned, the more turf you cover, the more points you get. This isn't actually much of an indication of how well you've played. After all, you get points for covering enemy ink, so if you're beating the other team so bad they don't get a chance to put much ink down, you'll likely get fewer points than if it were a healthy back and forth. This isn't really a big deal, it doesn't affect the competitive viability of the mode or anything like that. In fact, nothing I've said about Turf War is really a complaint. The main point, that I've taken way too long to make, is that Turf War isn't as well suited for high-skill competitive play as the ranked modes. That's it. And that's fine, because that's not what it was meant for. It's meant to be a way for new players to jump in and get used to the game. A low-stress environment where you can check out a weapon you're not used to, and most importantly, with turfing still playing an important role in the other game modes, Turf War serves as a great way for even veteran players to train arguably the most fundamental aspect of the game. See, this is what I'm talking about. True accessibility. Catering to casuals and tryhards, noobs and pros. I know having a simpler game mode in casual queue and a more complex one in ranked isn't anything revolutionary, but I bet there are a lot of gamers who would be surprised to hear it's the case for Splatoon. Anyway, there's a lot of fun to be had in Turf War. Despite its limitations, seeing my score tick up never stops being satisfying. Even the end screen with our boy Judd has sort of a shallow satisfaction to me. It's fun doing something to get a bunch of ink out at the last second, like tossing a sub-weapon or using an ink strike, and then seeing the end screen and being like, oh hey, there it is, there's my ink, I did that. Not to mention the fun in predicting who won. You still with me, by the way? I think this is going to be the longest review I've made yet. Should have made myself a drink. I mean, I've got water, but a drink. Well, anyway, I think I'm calling it. That's it for now. In this video, I hope I was able to explain the basics behind Splatoon's appeal from a variety of perspectives, but particularly as a competitive multiplayer game. If you are someone who tends to play such games and you didn't think of Splatoon that way, hopefully now you get it. Splatoon seems like a game tailor-made for casuals. A game for kids, man-children, art-hoes, pedophiles, and worst of all, Nintendo fanboys. It's a great game for all of those, but it was always intended to be something more. This is teased in the game itself. The silver and gold arrow sprays, the ink strike, ink surrounding the screen as you take damage. These are all included almost certainly as homages to things military shooters have both been praised and mocked for. Bloody screen, so real. Anyway, I need to stop. I said I would stop. I don't know if you've heard, but Splatoon actually has a sequel. It's called Splatoon 2. Truth is, I'd rather be playing it, so I'm done for now. Tune into the next video, a review of Splatoon 2, or I'll kill you with this gun.